the 28th, 2006. I am Joe Bruckner. I'm at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and we're interviewing Mr. Joe Stilwell today as part of the Veterans History Project. Mr. Stilwell, I want to tell you how much we appreciate you coming in here and sharing your experiences with us.
Thank you.
Would you give us your full name, your date of birth, and where you currently live?
Joe R. Stilwell, Stilwell. Date of birth is 12/14/24.
Mr. Stilwell, would you tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you were born, about your family?
I was born in Charlotte at the Presbyterian Hospital, and my wife was born in Concord, North Carolina. We have 3 children. Chip, who served full term of 21 years with the U.S. Navy, flying F-14s, etc. Sally, our daughter, is married to Jim Elliott here in Atlanta. They have 3 children, and incidentally, Chip has 2. Carl is our youngest son, and he is married with 1 child.
How many brothers and sisters did you have? And tell us a little bit about your family when you were growing up.
Had 1 brother, older, 5 years older than I, who joined the service in July of '41 and served in the Pacific and was a quartermaster with the Air Corps, mostly flying, when he did fly, in B-25s and 26s, or the Flying Rocks as they called them. 2 sisters, both younger, and Mom and Dad were from the Mecklenburg County area. During the Depression, I had to live with my grandmother on my mother's side, and my older brother and mother and father moved back to the family home place where my dad's mom and dad lived. We didn't realize that there was a depression. I think most of us of Depression times, they were all tough. You didn't know that you didn't have anything because you didn't miss it.
When did you enter the military?
I qualified for the Naval Aviation Cadet program and was told to go home and bring back a ditty bag to be ready to be sworn in Atlanta, having been brought down from Charlotte by train. When I got back to the enlistment headquarters the next morning to be all ready to come to Atlanta, they told me enlistments had closed the night before, and of course I was 17 3/4 about that time, and it was too late for me to join the Air Corps. So I volunteered to be drafted so that I could get into the Air Corps after passing all the Air Corps tests for aviation cadet training. And this was in April of '43. I was called to active duty in May the 27th of '43, and I reported to Biloxi, Mississippi for the basic training. And after basic, we were assigned to West Virginia University for college training detachment, which all cadets, or at that time we were aviation students, were assigned. And we stayed there for 3 months, getting in about 15 hours of stick time with a local instructor flying Stensons.
During your training, was this the first time you had traveled around the country to other places?
I had gotten a trip from Charlotte down to Carolina Beach on one summer, and other than that, I think I had been as far south as Fort Mill, South Carolina, and as far north as Salisbury, North Carolina. So, no, I hadn't done a whole lot of traveling.
Did you have an opportunity to deal with the civilians much in the various places where you trained?
Yeah, I guess you would say you dealt with people as you went into towns, but I don't think I did a whole lot in Biloxi. I don't remember even having a pass there. But one interesting fact there was one day while we were waiting to be shipped out between basic and the CTD, we were waiting around, and they assigned you various details. We got assigned to a truck that was delivering rations, groceries, etc., to a group of illiterates. Is about the best way I can describe it, because these people, men that were in the Air Corps, could not read nor write. And they were out from Gulfport, maybe 15 or 20 miles north of Gulfport, in some swamp that the Air Corps had set up a camp in. And of course each of us had at least high school education, so we were capable of reading and writing their letters. We would be assigned to 5 or 6 guys and have to read their letters from home or from their girlfriends, etc., and then rewrite the letters back to them. And when we left, we stopped along the Gulf down there a little bit at one of the Coke stands to get a nickel Coke. And when you walked into this little gas station, it looked like they had a room about 8 by 8 that the Coke machines were in, and then there was a door at the back that you walked out over the Gulf, and here were slot machines.
Really?
And I walked up to the 50-cent machine, did not put anything in it, but I reached up and pulled the handle down, and it went clank, clank, clank. And I pulled up my 10 50-cent pieces that they had dropped out, and I took one and put it back in, and it clanked again, and I got 10 more. So I took my nickel Coke and my winnings and went back to the truck and sat down and drank my Coke. But that was about the nearest thing to gambling I ever did, other than flying.
Yeah. And what were you being trained to do while you were in your training?
At this point, I was being trained to be a pilot. There were instances where we realized that we could be assigned to pilot training, navigator training, or bombardier training. But that was the cadet program at that time.
Had you ever been in an airplane prior to that?
No.
Describe your feelings when you first went up in the plane.
I can't. That's been too long ago to even think about.
Continue with your training experiences, where you were and where you went.
In West Virginia, we did several interesting things that I guess maybe some college students would do, but our group was kind of a maverick bunch, and we had a couple of rather sharp individuals who wrote a skit with all original music, and I wish I had the copies of it. Wish I'd retained even the program, but we put on a 2.5-hour show with some of the local college students, and did a lot of singing and dancing and carrying on, raising Cain. But from there, I went to Nashville, Tennessee, from the Morgantown, West Virginia, where University of West Virginia is. We went to Nashville, Tennessee, and were reclassified or classified, whichever case you want to put it, but I was classified in navigation. And I guess the reason that I was put in navigation was that I had excelled in mathematics in my high school training, and probably scored a little higher than I should have, or I'd gotten in pilot training. But we finished up with navigation training down at Monroe, Louisiana at Selman Field. And one of the interesting things there, and I still haven't figured out how they decided to wash out the various ones of us that they did, but they washed out about a third of the class, maybe a little higher. But the last test they gave us was an assimilation of distances, 4-point takeoff and landings, and headings, etc., with all the pertinent information. And I was the only cadet that aced the test, and yet 4 days later I was invited to be an armor gunner, or a radio gunner, an engineer gunner, or a career gunner, or an infantryman. And I opted out to be an armor gunner because it was a 12-week program plus 6 weeks of gunnery. So that put me in combat about as quickly as I could get there without being a career gunner, which at that time they were saying that the potential livelihood of a career gunner in combat was somewhere between 12 and 15 seconds. So that wasn't very inviting. From there, I went to armament in Denver. From there to Kingman, Arizona for gunnery training. And in gunnery training, we did most of our work in Kingman, but the last 2 weeks was done in Yucca Flats, and this would have been in the latter part of July, early August of '44. They quite often said that it was 130 degrees, 140 degrees in the shade and no shade, and about the only thing that we could do to cool off was get in the swimming pool. But problem was, when you got out of the water, you had to contend with what water was splashing up onto the concrete, was boiling by the time you got on there, so it wasn't much fun. We trained from, generally speaking, we would have class from 4 to 12, and in the afternoons you were free to sleep or whatever. And there were no air conditionings back then, of course. But from Kingman, I got a 10-day delay en route from Kingman home and back to Lincoln, Nebraska. And we spent a whole day sitting in a troop train outside of Kansas City waiting for passage through St. Louis on to Atlanta. And they just had too many trains coming through there at the time, so I didn't get to get home till I guess it was probably the 5th day. And I got 2 days at home and had to take off back to Lincoln, Nebraska, because it's going to take 2 to 3 days to get back there, and I sure as heck didn't want to be late. And at that time, we were assigned to crews of 10 to be assigned to B-17s. And from there, we went to OTU, Overseas Training Unit, in Dyersburg, Tennessee, for our training as a crew. And we had met crew members, other enlisted crew members, those being the officers were the four key people. And while in Dyersburg, we had usual experiences. The most unusual experience was my mother came over to visit with me for 2 or 3 days, and she was in the hotel downtown one night when we had a flight plan that we were supposed to go on a cross-country mission, but as we lined up on the tarmac to taxi out to the runway, we tied up with a plane that had been having some problems. You could smell diesel fuel or aviation fuel in the bomb bays pretty heavily. And fortunately, we were in the other plane that night. We had flown in that plane one time before, but that night we were in another plane. And as we were sitting there, the other plane took off and went about 200, well, I guess it was 2 miles off the end of the runway and blew. So we were told to go back to the hard stand, park, and wait for instructions. And before we got back there, they told us to turn around and go back and take off and circle the fire. Well, after about 30 minutes of circling, they told us to go ahead on a cross-country mission, do what we wanted to, and come back after a while. Well, this was in Dyersburg, which is in the northwest corner of Tennessee. Our engineer's home was in Tunnel Hill or Lafayette, Georgia. So we decided that was the closest place. So we came to Lafayette, Georgia, and I wish that I could remember the movie that was on that night, because we were down low enough to hear the windows rattle in the storefronts, and I think that I could read the marquee that told about the movie that was on that night, but I'm sure the sheriff was calling the Air Corps to let them know that we were up there, but they didn't know who we were, thank goodness. But we made it back, and when we got back into the base, everybody looked at us as if we were ghosts, because they thought we had been the ones who had gone in that night. And fortunately, my mother had not heard about it until I came in, went into the hotel the next morning, and told her that this plane had gone down. Don't really remember a whole lot about the rest of the training there, other than the fact that the enlisted men one day checked out a full case of 12-gauge shotgun shells, and we went to the skeet range, and the 6 of us shot that full case of shotgun shells at skeet. And we had a lot of fun that day. Then comes the trip back to Lincoln, where they assigned us to the ETO, the European Theater, and put us on a train to Boston, this being early part of December of 44. And the train took us from Lincoln up to Detroit and across the border into Canada, and I got to see my first real batch of snow. When you see snow up to the windows of a train, that's a lot of snow, and I was unaccustomed to that, to say the least. We arrived in Boston at Camp Miles Standish, where we hung around for 2 days waiting for ship availability, and we went out on the I think it was the USS Manhattan, which had been a luxury liner before the war, but had been changed over into a troop carrier, and we had 5,000 men on that troop ship. The ship had a pretty bad name for itself. It caught fire down around Savannah somewhere on one of its ventures out, but we were able to make it across and got into Liverpool. And I honestly don't remember what day in December it was, but it had to have been around the 21st, 22nd, because we left from Liverpool on a train to Avon, Stratford-on-Avon, which was the Wash. No, it wasn't Wash, not Stone. Stone was the name of the area that they put us in, and this was to reassign us, or to assign us to a station in England.
Now, when you got over there, this was about the time of the Battle of the Bulge. Were they
Yes.
keeping you informed of that, what was
No,
going on, or
no,
did you have any idea of what
no,
was happening?
no idea whatsoever. We were so self-contained and centered, and you didn't worry about the rest of the world.
Yeah.
We were looking forward to getting in that B-17 and flying over Germany and dropping bombs or shooting down ME-109s, Focke-Wulf 140s. Never did see either.
Really? Well, tell us about your experiences in England and then your experiences flying over Europe.
Well, we got to the base on Christmas Eve of '44. We did several days of flying around England, more or less orienting, getting accustomed to where we were, etc. More involved with the pilot and co-pilot and navigator relative to their abilities to get to and from the base. And of course, the radio man was very vital at that point too. The rest of us, the waist gunners, tail gunner, ball turret gunner, pretty much stayed home. The flight crew for most of the training was basically the pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and engineer and radio man. We flew our first mission on January the 13th. I got shot down on March the 9th over Frankfurt on our 16th mission. So I have always said I flew only 15 and a half missions, and my wife fussed at me, and 3 years ago we went to up in North Carolina, and they gave me an airplane trip on a B-17, which she says, I don't want to ever hear you saying that you have not completed your 16th mission anymore. So my oldest son and I took that flight out over home stamping grounds, actually, where I had grown up. A lot of the area was very familiar looking down at it, and he and I sneaked our way up into the nose of the B-17, so we got a first-hand view of the surrounding area. But that's jumping ahead a little bit. I remember on our first mission, we lost the commander of the base. His plane got hit. He was in the lead plane, and he got hit, and they started in a spiral down, and I counted 6 parachutes, and nobody else in the whole group counted any. So I was pleased to find out later that those 6 had survived, so that they were taken prisoner, but they were still survived. One of the other missions, we got over Germany, and the primary target was socked in, as we claimed. Clouds wouldn't allow the bombardier to pinpoint his drop. So we were starting back to England, and they saw it dropped down to 12,000 feet from 30,000, and they saw a little train running back and forth down there, and they decided that would be a good target to hit, and that's about as close to seeing someone blasted into eternity that I saw the entire time. That was rather mindful, and I do remember it very vividly, and seeing that little plane, that little train come up into the air 300, 400, 500 feet.
Wow.
As a result of the bomb load that hit. And we don't know how many of our, I guess we had 48 planes in this particular flight that were dropping on that one little train. And he didn't have much of a chance. And especially at 12,000 feet, they could pretty well pinpoint him. And I do remember seeing that thing go tumbling up in the air. The day that we got shot down was over Frankfurt. The control cables had been shot out, and I had put on my emergency oxygen tank and gone back into the tail and was repairing the cables when the bell rang to abandon ship, and I quit worrying with those, went back forward and started getting the ball turret man out. Fortunately, his unit had not frozen up or been hit, so we were able to use the hydraulics to get him out. And I had a whale of a time kicking the door open. In fact, they claimed that they tapped me on the shoulder, only it was a pretty hard tap to get me to leave the plane. And I counted one and pulled the ripcord when they tell you to do 10, because and I did one because the parachutes were not opening every time that toward the close of the war, and as a result I wanted plenty of time to use my trusty little pocket knife to open that parachute up. And since we bailed out at about 20,000, so I had plenty of time. And recently I had a group of kids in a 5th grade school class asked me how I breathe between 20 and 14, where you're supposed to put your mask on, or your oxygen mask on. And I said, well, I didn't really worry too much about it at the time, because it wasn't anything I could do about it one way or the other, and I have to assume that somehow or other, having been on oxygen for about 4 hours at that time, that I had absorbed enough to allow me to come down. I don't have any scientific information to tell me differently, but I know that my straps were not tight, so I suffered from when the chute did open. And it was a long ways down. I had to pass through clouds, and then I had 3 airplanes that were circling me, and I didn't know whether they were Germans or Americans, and thank goodness when I finally did get a sight of them, they were P-51s, which followed me all the way to the ground. And when I hit the ground, I broke my all 5 metatarsals in my left foot. Quite painful, and unfortunately I was wearing the fleece-lined boots rather than the GI boots that had snapped the strings that normally we tied onto our bomb shackles. our, not bomb shackles, our straps, harness, and the strings were apparently just too weak for that jolt, and they broke. And as a result, I hit the ground with only those fleece-lined boots, and the only thing I could figure there was the wind was carrying me up on an incline, slight hill, and when I hit, I was at a angle where my left foot took the blunt and broke all 5 metatarsals. I walked into town, but when I got, they set me and my navigator came into the same little town, and just incidentally, his parachute had hung up in a tree, and he had been slapped against the trunk of the tree, and he had to walk all the way across Germany to Moosburg from Frankfurt. And when they got him back into the States, they x-rayed his back, and he had a broken back.
Good grief.
And he had been pushing me and our gear that we had left in a wheelbarrow that they confiscated in order to get to the next little village, which had a jail in it. That little town that we landed in did not have a jail in it, so they had to haul us to the next little town, which was 2 or 3 miles away.
When you first landed,
Yeah.
what happened then? What did you see, and who saw
Well,
you?
the people were coming out of the little village up the hill. Well, they were probably 200 or 300 yards from me by the time I got to the ground. So they were there, right on top of me, and there was 3 Wehrmacht, the old men's army, and they were in charge of the jail. And as far as I can remember, those were the only servicemen I saw until the truck came to pick us up the next day. You get to a point. After being kept overnight, and our food source was 3 apples, that was all we had to eat during the next day there. And 2 of the guys were in their 50s, I'd say, and they wanted to kill us. The older man was in his 70s, and he was kind of saying, "Whoa, let's don't do anything drastic. Let's just hold on. Don't try to do anything drastic. Just let these fellows live. We call the people, and they'll come get them and take them off to prison camp." So that's what happened. We were taken down to Dulag Luft, which was in Oberursel, Oberursel, Germany. It's kind of northwest of downtown Frankfurt, maybe 20 miles. On that same property, which is probably a good-sized farm or estate, whatever you want to call it, there was a hospital. And this hospital had been built by several of the rich barons at an earlier time, and some of them had built homes, summer homes, around the hospital, and this was to bring their, shall I say, mentally challenged children into, because it was turned out to be a hospital for the insane. And during the war, they had taken hospital for injured airmen. They brought no ground troops there. It was all airmen. In the Air Corps, all of the men flying in an airplane were staff sergeants or above, flying over Europe, over Germany. And that was because the Germans accepted the fact that a staff sergeant was the equivalent to their officers. And as such, they treated us differently.
And what rank were you?
Staff.
And what was your unit? I want to be sure we get that on foot.
I was in the 96th Bomb Group, 339th Bomb Squadron. And the location of the base was Snetterton Heath, and the train station was Eccles Road. It's about 6 or 8 miles from Norwich in the northeastern segment of England, which was basically East Anglia is what they call that area. We have since found out that there were an air station every 5 miles from Norwich, just about any way you went. So there were a bunch of airplanes taking off and landing at those places.
Describe your treatment, the conditions that you faced, and the relationship you had with the other prisoners and with the German guards for that matter.
In the interrogation area, which we'll start there first, we were picked up at the little jail in the little village and taken to the interrogation center, which was the Dulag Luft. And the fellow who interviewed me was from Chicago, Illinois, spoke better English than I did. Very intelligent man. Do not know his name or anything of that nature, but do know that he prodded and pried and tried to get me to admit to more than name, rank, and serial number, but I'm afraid I was one of those that believed that that was what I was supposed to talk about, and that was it. So they didn't get a whole lot out of me. Not that I knew a whole lot, but apparently there was a lot of people that couldn't resist bragging a little bit. And one of the more amazing things to me was that they knew more about me than I knew about them, because they told me who had serviced our plane the day before. I mean, they knew that we were not in a plane from our bomb group. We were borrowing a plane from another bomb group. In other words, we had been assigned to this plane because it was available. Brand new plane, B-17, first mission it had ever flown. And it hadn't even been painted the olive drab. It was still shiny aluminum. Had all the finest up-to-date instrumentation, etc. Once, let's see, they had me in about a 4x8, maybe 10-foot room. They fed me soup. And the interesting part about that, the soup that they fed us was made of hot water and carrot and turnip tops, which I've learned since was probably the healthiest part of the rooted vegetables that we could have gotten. I'm sure there was a few potatoes in there, but I don't remember them. A little bit of black bread every once in a while, but once they put me in the hospital, which was at Uberussel, which was on the same property but in a different location. The Americans and English airmen who were already there actually did all the work as far as dealing with the prisoners of war. They saw to it that I was washed and cleaned up, and of course most of their concern was getting rid of what lice we might have picked up, or ticks, fleas, and whatever. And we had two German orderlies, I guess is what you would call them. One was a corporal, the other was a PFC. The corporal had supposedly been in the United States before the war and had gone back to Germany in '36 to see his ailing mother, and the Germans wouldn't allow him to come back, but he had been in Miami Beach, supposedly owned property down there, and wondered whatever happened to that property, but don't guess it was any concern. But they treated us pretty nicely, and when we heard Patton's forces come through on March the 27th at night, we asked him to go down to Frankfurt, which was probably a half a day's hitchhiking ride, somehow or other, that he got down to Frankfurt, and he told the Americans, who had already set up offices, etc., in Frankfurt, where we were, because this was kind of a pocket that we were in, and they would never found us. And on the 29th, they came up to get us, and we had a kind of a laugh with them, and a Jeep came into the gates first, and it had 2 men and 3 women, reporters, on the Jeep. They are the ones who came in to our post first. Well, shortly thereafter, we hear this tremendous gunfire, and wasn't but just a little while till the GI trucks came in. About 30 minutes later, I couldn't stand it any longer. I had to find out about all that skirmishing going on, so I sidled up to one of the buck sergeants who seemed to be in charge, and I said, "What in the world was all that gun firing going on down there a while ago?" And he says, "Oh, one of the guys saw a deer run across the road and decided he wanted venison for supper." And I don't know whether you've ever seen the deer in that part of Germany or not, but they're maybe 18 inches tall. I mean, these were 20 caliber machine guns, or cannons, that were shooting at this thing, and so it couldn't have been much left if he hit it. But
what were your emotions when you saw the first Americans come through to liberate you?
It's hard to explain. I don't know that I even have the capacity now to describe it. It's probably close to the experience you have with your firstborn. Something that you haven't experienced before, or you don't expect to experience again, but it was very emotional. I'm sure there's a bunch of crying going on. If not crying out, it was certainly a lot of tears. From there, we were put on 6-bys and taken into Frankfurt for what would be classified now, I guess, as somewhat of a debriefing session. And then we were taken to a set up that was across the river Which river, I have no clue. Probably the Main. And it was on the edge of a landing strip, and they had 4 or 5 barracks set up that were those temporary units that were wood up for about 4 feet and then tent and netting above that. They made sure we had medical attention at that point. Came over and took a look at us and said, "Okay, you're still alive." And a C-47 flew in on Sunday morning. This was Easter Sunday, April the 1st. Flew me back to Bristol, England, where I was in the hospital for 30 days. President Roosevelt died on the 12th of April. I was there in that hospital in Bristol. I got one pass that I was able to go into London and back up to my base. All of my goods had already been packed up and sent home. And I had just bought myself a brand new pair of nice leather shoes, slippers. They were nowhere to be found, of course. But most everything else got home okay. And while I was at the base, the radio man's brother had come in, and we visited for a couple, 3 hours. And he knew that he had survived because our bombardier had been flying navigator for another plane that day, and he had seen us all go down, but he had seen all the chutes come out, so he knew that we were okay, gotten out at least. Didn't know how badly any of us were hurt, and I guess I was the only one that was hurt badly at the time, although the navigator was hurt a whole lot worse than I was with his broken back.
Did you lose any friends, either flying or in the camp?
Did not lose any in the camp. To say that you lost friends flying, I have my serious doubts that you allowed yourself that kind of a relationship. I mean, I don't remember anyone who got shot down that I knew in the short period of time that I was there. When you were in between missions, you either stood down and did washing or nothing, read books, meandered around, or did local stuff, you know. It seems to me like we went to London 3 or 4 times in that 2-month period. I tell a lot of people that I don't claim a real record, but I think that my time overseas and the amount of the number of missions, the time that I spent in the hospitals, and the time I got back to the States probably is a record for World War II. Now, going over took me 10 days. Coming back, I had 4 breakfasts. Every landing was 6 hours apart, so I left on the 1st and got back here on the 30th. So,
but you did a lot while you were over there in a short period of time.
Correct.
in the service once you got back to the United States?
I stayed in the hospitals from, well, I got back to the States on the 1st, and I went to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey from not McGuire. Yeah, McGuire Air Force Base in on Long Island. That's where we landed, and I went from there over to Camp Kilmer. From Camp Kilmer, they put me on a train and brought me to Moore General Hospital in Asheville or Swannanoa, North Carolina. Stayed there for a couple months. And then I went down to Camp Davis out of Wilmington, and I was there for about a month and a half, I guess. While there, Buddy and I hitchhiked our way down to Carolina Beach, and we were walking down the boardwalk one day, and one of our Marine friends decided he wanted to buzz the boardwalk. So he was maybe 50 feet in the air. I doubt it, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But I looked over, after he passed, I looked over at my buddy and I said, "What are you doing down here?" And he says, "Well, same thing you are." And we were under the boardwalk, digging for China.
Smart move.
I mean, I had never been shot at. I've never, by an airplane. I've been shot at and shot down by ACAC, but I don't know why we both had that instinct.
Yeah.
I guess it's just a self-preservation type thing.
I can
You
understand.
die for cover.
Yeah.
But I went from there, from Davis to Miami. Well, actually, I went back to, supposed to have gone to Greensboro for reassignment. Come to find out after about a couple weeks that Greensboro didn't have the authority to reassign POWs, ex-POWs. So they sent me down to Miami Beach, and I went down there and spent a couple, 3 weeks lollygagging around down there in some of those $150, $200 a night rooms that the government was inviting us to. And when I left there, I had a 60-day furlough, which was privy to POWs. So 1st of November, I was to report to a base at Laurinburg, Maxton in North Carolina. And they had me assigned to a small arms range. And when I got there, the old boy that was checking me in says, "You want out of this Army?" And I said, "Certainly." He says, "Well, you got more points than everybody else on the base. No need in you going down to the small arms range. Just hang around with me, and you and I'll go get discharged here later on in the week." Well, he was already assigned to be discharged for a farmer's bit. So he and I got our orders on, that was on a Monday that I checked in, and Thursday we got our orders, and no, Friday we got our orders, and we hitchhiked our way from Laurinburg, Maxton, which was below Fayetteville, up to Goldsboro, where he goes in. We get in there about 10:30, and he happens to know the ropes, so he goes in, gets our name put on the roster for the next morning, and about 10 o'clock I'm out of the service.
Wow.
Saturday morning, and November the 10th. Now, an oddity, my brother was on the West Coast. He came in from South Pacific. He was discharged on the West Coast on November the 10th.
Gee.
At the same time I was being discharged on the East Coast.
Good gosh.
Now,
What a coincidence.
just a whole bunch of them.
Well, going back a few months, when we dropped the bombs on Japan and the war was effectively ended, what was your feeling at that point when you realized that that had happened and it was going to be over.
I see, that was,
It was earlier that year, a little bit earlier in 45.
yeah, that was in August.
Yeah.
See, I was at home. I was at the home on VE Day. I don't remember where I was on VJ Day.
Were you pretty sure that even if the war continued in the Pacific that you would not be involved in that, or was there a chance you would have been involved in that?
There was a chance. There had been rumors, but the rumors were dispelled by the fact that we had been POWs. Therefore, we probably would not be called for that duty.
Yeah. Now, did you ever go back to Europe after you got out of the military in the later years to visit
Well, I
any of the sites?
I had a passion, and wouldn't allow my family nor friends that I had any coercion on to buy anything from Germany nor Japan. And my wife decided she needed an iron, so my daughter convinced me to let her buy Mama a German iron. This has been less than about 15 years ago. So that was the first piece of equipment that I allowed my family to have. So I had no interest in going back to Germany. We had gone to Switzerland and England and had gone back to the base. We went back in '94, and our bomb group had commissioned a stained glass window in a little Anglican church right off the base, and it was being rededicated for the 50th anniversary. Well, on the way back, we decided that that would be an excellent thing to have that copied and put into the museum, because the museum was being built at that time, or being planned and built. And ultimately that happened, only it was put into the chapel that is now at the museum.
Wow.
And is the centerpiece behind the pulpit, so to say.
Right.
Our stained glass window is the centerpiece. Okay. There are others that are in there that will take as much credit as ours, but ours was first. Because ours was built and was mounted in a frame and put into the museum several years before the chapel was ever built. The rest of the story, how much time we got on here? Close?
You just continue, and
we'll
if
stop.
we
Okay.
run out of tape, we'll put a new tape in.
Okay. The rest of the story is that I mentioned earlier that I got my 16th mission finished a couple of years ago in North Carolina. And at that time, my oldest son was planning a trip to Milan, Italy, and to Brussels that were to be together, and he invited me to go along. He had enough air miles to carry it, and he had plenty of Marriott points to deal with it, so we thoroughly enjoyed a trip to Italy, and on the way we got a train pass and went to Stuttgart and then into Frankfurt. And in Frankfurt we went out to Oberkassel and visited the hospital, which had expanded tremendously, and we got a young lady doctor, psychiatrist, who
showed us around, showed me the room that I had stayed in, and we found all kinds of stuff that was very interesting. But as we were getting ready to leave, she says, "Is there anything else I can help you with?" And we said, "Yeah, we can't find school cripping." Well, she says, "Bring your map and I'll show it to you." Well, she showed us the place, and it was written, abbreviated in German. We would have never found it. But we go to school cripping. It's like 30, 40 minutes by car away from the hospital. And we wandered around, and uh-oh,